My own daughter thought that because I had lost my hearing, I was completely helpless. I had to sit there in silence, pretending I couldn't hear a thing as she and her husband plotted to have me declared incompetent so they could steal my home. For weeks, I endured their suffocating care, smiling while they isolated me from my friends and whispered behind my back about their final plan. But they made one fatal mistake. They had no idea my hearing had secretly returned, and I used every word they said to set a trap they never saw coming. You know, the sun that time of day filtering through my bay window had a funny way of making everything look both beautiful and sad. It was the color of weak tea, and it lit up all the little dust motes dancing in the air. For the longest time after my David passed, the silence in this house was just suffocating. Then about a year ago, the world went completely quiet when an infection took my hearing. But here's the thing. The secret I've been holding on to tighter than the deed to my own home for the last 3 weeks. The sound has been coming back. First a trickle, and now I can hear everything. So there I was, sitting in my armchair, watching my daughter Jessica arrange a platter of cheeses. Her hands were moving with this sharp, frantic energy that was a world away from the bright, perfect smile she had fixed on her face. And Mark, my son-in-law, he just stood by the mantelpiece, swirling his wine and glancing at the grandfather clock like he was waiting for a bomb to go off. Jessica's voice was too loud a habit she hadn't broken yet. She was saying how lovely it was, just a quiet Sunday with the 3 of us. I gave her the gentle, vacant smile I'd been perfecting, and I nodded. Across the room, I saw Mark catch her eye and give this tiny, anxious shake of his head. The air was just buzzing with everything they weren't saying. They thought my world was silent, but I could hear it all, the frantic rhythm of their lies, the sharp edge of their desperation. It had all started so subtly, this campaign of theirs. A week ago, Jessica started visiting more, her voice dripping with this sticky sweet concern. She'd tell me I shouldn't be climbing on a stool to dust and then move the stool to the garage. She decided the phone ringer was too loud and might startle me, so she silenced it, insisting it was easier if she just screened my calls. When my neighbors would drop by, one of them would always meet them at the door, explaining politely that I was resting and not up for visitors. They were building a cage around me, you see. Not with bars, but with love, padding it with so much concern, they hoped I wouldn't feel the lock click shut. This afternoon was the final piece of their plan, and it arrived disguised as a stack of mail. Jessica sat right next to me, her knee bumping mine, and told me it was just some boring bank form standard stuff for updating their records. She'd even marked where I needed to sign. She handed me a pen and this thick document clipped to a folder that hid the title. I played my part, squinting at the dense legal text with what I hoped looked like confusion. She pointed to a line at the very bottom of the last page telling me it was just to confirm my address. I knew she was lying. My hand felt frail, but it was steady as I took the pen. I looked right into my daughter's eyes, searching for even a flicker of the little girl I'd raised, the one who used to cry if she accidentally stepped on a snail. But that girl was gone. All I saw was a polished, desperate stranger. I let out a quiet sigh, one they would take for weary compliance, and I signed my name. The second I did, Jessica snatched the document away, and for just a heartbeat, I saw a flash of triumph in her eyes before she buried it under another wave of dutiful affection. Later on, Jessica must have thought I'd dozed off in my chair. She took her phone into the hallway, but her voice, a harsh, panicked whisper, carried perfectly into the living room. I heard her hiss into the phone that she had it, that the signature was done. She was talking about needing another week, that Mark was trying to move an assessment up. Then her voice cracked with panic. She said they were out of time, that a foreclosure notice had arrived yesterday. They had until the end of the month before it all went public. I heard her say it plain as day, the end of the month. My eyes opened. The setting sun was casting these long, dark shadows across the floor, striping the rug like prison bars. The gilded cage was no longer a fear. It was real. And they had just turned the key. By the way, if you're enjoying the story so far, please consider subscribing so you don't miss what's next. We'd also love to hear your own story if you'd like to share it with our community. Now let's get back to it. I sat in that dark living room for what felt like hours, just watching those shadows creep across the floor. The shock had worn off, replaced by something cold and hard, settling in my chest. By the time Tuesday morning rolled around, I had a plan. The house was quiet. Jessica and Mark were off somewhere, probably toasting to their success, completely convinced of my ignorance. And you know what? That confidence was going to be their undoing. It was time for my first move, just a gentle little nudge to see how quickly their story would unravel. My target was Mark. Jessica. She was the real strategist here, driven by a coldness I was only just beginning to understand. But Mark was a different story. He was a man coming apart at the seams, all bluster and arrogance covering up a deep well of panic. He wasn't the driver of this scheme, he was just a terrified passenger, and I knew he was the one who would crack first. He showed up that afternoon with his toolbox, pretending he was there to fix a leaky faucet under the kitchen sink. I was ready for him. I sat in the living room with my knitting, the perfect picture of a frail old woman. I could hear him clattering around for a few minutes, and then he emerged, wiping his hands on a towel. He announced with that fake cheeriness of his that it was all fixed good as new. I set down my knitting and looked right at him. I made sure to use my hands a little as I spoke, signing a few words to keep up the act. I thanked him, telling him how helpful they both were. Then I let the silence hang in the air for a moment before I dropped the hook. I mentioned that Jessica had said something about updating bank papers, and I just hoped everything was all right. With their finances, it was like I'd physically struck him. All the color just washed out of his face. I saw a muscle in his jaw start to jump. He opened his mouth and then closed it again, looking like a fish pulled from the water. He stammered, asking why I would ask that, insisting they were fine. His voice was at least an octave higher than usual. He tried to explain that Jessica just helps with the paperwork, since it's so hard for me to get to the bank these days. I just nodded and went back to my knitting, pretending to accept his answer. I told him, of course, it's just that a friend of mine, Eleanor, her son-in-law, had gotten into a bit of trouble recently, lost his job, in finance. It was all very sudden, I said. That's when the panic in his eyes turned into a wildfire. The words just started tumbling out of his mouth, a frantic rush to build a wall of lies. He insisted it was nothing like that work was great, wicked busy, actually, and that he had a huge deal closing next month. A few minutes later, he was gone, practically running to his car. The fish had taken the bait. Not even an hour later, I heard a car screech into the driveway. Jessica burst through the door, her face a storm cloud of fury and fear. She forgot to raise her voice when she demanded to know what I had said to Mark. I just looked up from my knitting with my best confused expression, signing slowly that I'd only thanked him for fixing the sink. She said he told her I was asking about their finances, and why would I do that? I'd upset him. I kept my voice soft, telling her I was just making conversation, that I was worried. She snapped back that I shouldn't be. Everything was fine, she said. Mark's job was fine. They were fine. The only thing I needed to worry about was getting my rest. And right there, it was clear. Mark in his terror had invented a huge business deal. Jessica, the enforcer, was trying to shut down the topic entirely. They were amateurs. That evening, Jessica was in the garden pacing back and forth on another one of her tense phone calls. That was my chance. I went to the bookshelf, retrieved the tiny, voice-activated recorder I'd bought a few weeks ago, and tucked it neatly inside the hollowed-out spine of an old copy of Great Expectations. Then I walked to the kitchen, picked up the landline they thought I couldn't hear, and dialed a number I knew by heart. When my late husband's younger brother David, a retired lawyer, answered, I kept my voice steady. I told him, "David, it's Carol. I need your help. I'm in trouble." After that day, the air in the house shifted. Their care became pure surveillance. Jessica took my car keys, saying it was just in case I felt dizzy. Mark installed new heavy-duty locks on all the doors for my safety, he claimed. They thought they were sealing me in, but I knew the truth. They were only sealing their own fate. The danger felt real, a cold knot in my stomach. But underneath it, a new feeling was starting to bloom, the undeniable thrill of the fight. For the next week, I played the part of the perfect patient. I decided to come down with a convenient little cold. Nothing serious, just enough to keep me in my room, looking more fragile and compliant than ever. It worked like a charm. I let Jessica bring me my meals on a tray, fluff my pillows, and condescendingly fill me in on all the neighborhood gossip I was supposedly missing. The weaker I seemed, the more their arrogance swelled. They saw my retreat as a total surrender, and from the safety of their supposed victory, they started to get careless. My little recorder, tucked away in that copy of Great Expectations, became my most valuable ally. One evening, I heard them whispering in the kitchen. Jessica's voice was sharp with confidence. She told Mark that I hadn't asked another question since his little outburst. She thought his panic attack, as she called it, had scared me into line. Mark grumbled that it wasn't a panic attack, that I'd just surprised him, and they needed to be more careful. But Jessica just brushed him off. She said they were fine, that the final papers from their lawyer were ready. She told him about a wellness check scheduled for next Tuesday. A Dr. Albright and their lawyer would be there. I heard her say that once the doctor saw me so confused and dependent, getting an incompetency declaration would be a mere formality. And after that, the house would go on the market. They were so sure they had everything under control. That false security was the best weapon I could have asked for. It wasn't until much later, after all the dust had settled, that I pieced together the whole pathetic story of how they'd gotten into such a mess. It turned out that Mark had lost his high-paying finance job 6 months earlier. The shame must have been eating him alive, because he couldn't bring himself to tell Jessica or anyone in their competitive social circle where failure just isn't an option. Desperate, he saw an ad online for some new cryptocurrency, a once-in-a-generation opportunity, peddled by some slick salesman in a webinar. And in a fit of humiliation and terror, Mark didn't just invest their savings, he gambled them. Everything retirement, the kids' college funds, all of it gone in an instant. He had 1 week of watching the numbers climb, of feeling like a genius, and then the website vanished. The money was gone. The shame curdled into pure terror. The mortgage payments bounced. The bank's letters turned from concerned to threatening. Jessica finally found the foreclosure notice while snooping through his desk. The fight, I can only imagine, must have been apocalyptic. Their whole world built on his income, and their perfect image was about to implode. And it was in the middle of all that wreckage that Jessica, her eyes cold as ice, first voiced the unthinkable. She'd apparently said that I was sitting on $3 million of prime real estate all alone, unable to hear a thing, that it wasn't safe, that it was their duty to protect me. So, while they were busy planning my demise, I was in my bedroom executing my own strategy. They thought I was sleeping all afternoon, but I was preparing for war. My brother-in-law David had managed to smuggle a small burner phone to me. We communicated in hushed tones and texts. He emailed me a copy of the document I'd signed. It was worse than I thought, a durable power of attorney giving them immediate and sweeping control over everything. My stomach clenched reading it. But fear is a motivator. I found my old spare checkbook hidden away in a hat box on the top shelf of my closet and wrote out a substantial check for the retainer of a litigation specialist David had recommended. I located the original deed to the house and the portfolio of my late husband's investments, and I tucked them all into a secure folder. Every move was quiet, precise, invisible to my jailers. They saw a frail old woman fading away in her bedroom. They had no idea I was forging the very weapons that would bring about their destruction. Tuesday morning arrived crisp and bright, in that way only a New England autumn day can be. It was a beautiful day for a storm to break. Inside my house, Jessica was a blur of nervous energy arranging flowers that were already perfectly arranged, brewing coffee that was far too expensive, her face flushed with a greedy, anxious excitement. Mark just paced the oriental rug in the living room back and forth, straightening his tie over and over again. This was it. This was their final act. At 10 o'clock sharp, the doorbell chimed. Jessica smoothed her dress, took a deep breath, and opened it to reveal two men in dark suits. I recognized them from the descriptions David had helped me find online. One was Dr. Albright, the geriatric care manager, and the other was their lawyer, a man named Davies. Jessica's voice was like honey as she thanked them for coming, telling them how worried they were. She ushered them in, explaining that I was in the living room. I just sat in my armchair with a shawl draped over my shoulders, doing my best to look small and lost in the room I knew better than my own skin. I gave the men a weak, confused smile as they settled onto the sofa. Mr. Davies had just opened his briefcase when the doorbell rang again. I saw Jessica frown, a flicker of irritation crossing her face. She wasn't expecting anyone else. She opened the door, and there they were, a sharp-looking woman in her 50s, with a smile that was both warm and incredibly firm, and right beside her, my brother-in-law David, his face grim and determined. David's voice was steady when he greeted his niece. He told her this was Eleanor Vance, my legal counsel, and that they were here for the meeting. The panic that flashed across Jessica's face was a sight to behold. She stammered something about me not having a lawyer, asking what this was all about. But Eleanor didn't wait for an invitation. She stepped right past Jessica and into the living room. Her eyes locked onto the two startled men on my sofa. She introduced herself, explaining that she represented me, Carol Bennett, and that it seemed they all had a vested interest in my well-being. She told them not to let her interrupt. The air in the room practically crackled. Their lawyer Davies looked from Eleanor to Jessica and back again, his whole expression souring. This was clearly not the simple rubber stamp affair he'd been promised. Eleanor then turned her warm, sharp gaze on me. She asked me, Carol, if I was able to tell them all why we were here today. I looked at my daughter, her face a mask of disbelief. I looked at Mark, who looked like he was about to be physically ill. I took a slow, deliberate breath. And then, in a voice that was perfectly clear, strong and steady, I spoke. I told them, yes, I believe I am. We are here, I said, because my daughter and her husband are trying to have me declared legally incompetent so they can steal my house. The silence was so total, you could hear a pin drop. Jessica just stared, her mouth hanging open. Mark looked like he'd been struck by lightning. Jessica finally managed to stammer, asking what I'd said, asking if I could hear. I told her calmly that yes, for the past month, I could. I could hear everything. The lies, the whispers, the panicked phone calls about a foreclosure. I turned my head and looked directly at Mark, whose face was now a pasty shade of white. I asked him if that big deal he was closing was still on track. That was it. That was the pin that broke him. The whole facade of the successful man, the provider, it didn't just crack. It shattered into a million pieces. A terrible, gut-wrenching sob tore out of his throat. He cried out that he'd lost it all: the job, the money, everything. The confession came tumbling out in a wave of shame and despair. He told them all about the scam, how they were going to lose their house, how they were completely ruined. He just buried his face in his hands, his whole body shaking. But when I looked at my daughter, I saw no sympathy. I saw pure, unadulterated rage. Her voice was a raw shriek as she called him an idiot. A weak, pathetic idiot. She screamed that this was all his fault. The so-called professionals on my sofa were frozen, their faces a perfect picture of shock and alarm. The wellness check they'd been hired for had just imploded into a confession of attempted fraud and a vicious domestic brawl. In the middle of all that wreckage, I felt the shawl slip from my shoulders. I sat up straight. I was no longer the victim. The power in this room had shifted completely and forever. I looked at my weeping son-in-law, my seething daughter, and the stunned men they'd brought here to certify my irrelevance. My voice was like ice when I cut through the chaos. Now I said, I believe my lawyer has a few things to discuss. My living room, which had been a stage for so much quiet family drama, had now become a courtroom. Eleanor Vance stood holding a folder, and her calm authority was enough to silence the entire room. Mark's terrible sobs had quieted down to just these shuddering breaths, and Jessica just stood there, rigid, her face a pale mask of fury and humiliation. Eleanor began, her voice crisp and clear, stating that it was time to clarify the situation. She held up the document I had signed, the durable power of attorney. She stated for the record that on the afternoon of Sunday, August 10th, her client, Carol Bennett, was coerced into signing it, having been told it was a standard bank form. She looked directly at their lawyer and said his name, Mr. Davies, followed by a single powerful word: fraud. I watched Mr. Davies start to sputter, trying to say that his clients were only acting in what they perceived to be my best interests. But Eleanor didn't let him finish. She cut him off smoothly, her voice like silk over steel. She asked if they were acting in my best interest when they systematically isolated me from my friends and neighbors, when they disabled my phone, or she said, were they perhaps acting in their own best interest, given the foreclosure notice on their property, dated August 8th. And with that, she slid a copy of the notice across the coffee table. It landed with a soft, damning thud that echoed in the silent room. Dr. Albright, the care manager, shifted uncomfortably on my sofa. He mumbled that his assessment was supposed to be based on my fragility, my seeming confusion. I couldn't resist. I looked right at him, my voice ringing with a strength I hadn't felt in years, and told him that it was a confusion. I was feigning a performance that was, it seems, quite convincing. Then Eleanor produced the small digital recorder. She announced that for the past week, I had been recording the conversations in this very house. She pressed a button, and my daughter's voice, sharp and conspiratorial, filled the room. We all heard her planning the wellness check, talking about how confused and dependent I seemed, and how getting the incompetency declaration would be a formality before putting the house on the market. Eleanor clicked it off, and the silence that followed was heavy and absolute. Dr. Albright looked horrified, and I saw Mr. Davies, their lawyer, just slowly and deliberately begin to pack his briefcase. The judgment I wanted wasn't from a judge in a black robe. It was this. It was the shocked, condemning eyes of the very people they had brought here to be their pawns. Their whole story, the one about the caring daughter and the responsible son-in-law, had been completely dismantled, leaving only the ugly truth of their greed and desperation behind. Finally, Jessica's voice, now just a choked whisper, broke the silence. She asked me what I wanted. All the fight had just drained out of her, replaced by the cold, heavy dread of consequence. I looked at my daughter, and what I felt in that moment wasn't hatred. It was just a profound and weary sadness. The punishment I had planned wasn't fire and brimstone. It was simply the cold, hard reality of the law. Eleanor laid out the terms. First, she stated they would sign a document immediately revoking the power of attorney. Second, they would have no further financial or medical authority over my life effective immediately. All keys to this house were to be returned before they left today. She slid another set of papers across the table explaining that it was a no-contact order. They were not to call, visit, or attempt to contact me in any way. Any communication would have to go through her office, and any violation would result in immediate legal action. But the final consequence, the one that mattered most, had to come from me. A lawsuit calling the police. That would just be a messy, ugly war that would drag on for years. My solution was simpler, cleaner, and far more devastating. I looked my daughter in the eye, my gaze steady. I told her, "You are on your own. The financial catastrophe you created is yours to solve. You will not use me or my home as your escape route. You have made your choices. Now you will live with them." It was a complete and total checkmate. I wasn't just taking my pieces back, I was removing them from the board entirely. The justice I delivered wasn't cruel, but it was absolute. They were left with nothing but themselves and the truth of what they had tried to do exposed in the harsh light of a Tuesday morning. You know, after all the drama, their departure was such a quiet, pathetic little affair. There was no more shouting, no more tears. There was only the grim, silent finality of their surrender. I watched Jessica sign the papers Eleanor put in front of her. Then she walked to the hall table and placed her house key down. Her hand was trembling and she wouldn't look at me. Mark just followed behind her, his shoulders so slumped he looked like a marionette with its strings cut. The front door didn't slam. It just closed with a soft, definitive click that seemed to echo the end of an entire chapter of all our lives. In the weeks that followed, the fallout was swift. News travels fast in a town like Newton, you know. The story got out not in a dramatic explosion, but in a slow, suffocating tide of whispers and rumors. It was stripped of the ugly details, of course, but the essential truth remained. People heard that the Bennett Thompsons were in financial trouble, that they were selling their beautiful house, that Mark had made some bad investments. The very public humiliation they had been so terrified of had finally arrived. They sold their house in a rush for much less than it was worth and moved to a small, nondescript rental in a town a couple of hours away. Their carefully crafted social status was just erased. From what David told me later, their paths split dramatically after that. Mark, stripped of all his pride and arrogance, actually started going to therapy. He began looking for work, any work. He was a man completely humbled and broken by his own failure. But Jessica, she wrapped herself in a shell of bitter denial. In her version of the story, she was the victim. A victim of her husband's weakness and a victim of her mother's cruelty. The only other time I heard from her was a single venomous email sent through her lawyer accusing me of being unnatural and unforgiving. It was her final futile shot before she disappeared into a resentful silence. As for me, this house was no longer a gilded cage. It was my sanctuary, and I had reclaimed every inch of it. The silence was no longer something oppressive. It was peaceful. I started calling the old friends Jessica had so carefully pushed away. Soon, my afternoons were filled with lively card games and long chats over tea. I even signed up for a pottery class. There was something so satisfying about taking a lump of clay and shaping it into something new with my own two hands, hands that no longer felt frail at all. I hired a new financial advisor, a wonderfully savvy woman. and together we set up a charitable trust in my and my late husband's name. I wanted to make sure the wealth we had built would become a legacy of kindness, not a lure for greed. A few months later, on a crisp autumn afternoon, I was out in the garden trimming the last of the roses before the first frost. David was there with me, his easy, quiet company, a comfortable warmth against the autumn chill. He handed me a rake, and I paused for a moment, just looking at the familiar lines of my home with the sun glinting off the windows. It was more than just a house. It was a testament to a life well lived, a fortress I had successfully defended. I realized I hadn't just survived the betrayal. I had transformed its painful lesson into a quiet, unshakable kind of wisdom. The sound of the wind rustling through the old oak leaves was the only music I needed. It was a symphony of peace, of strength, and of a freedom that I would never, ever take for granted again. In the end, Carol's story wasn't just about revenge. It was a lesson in the nature of true strength. It teaches us that the quietest people in the room are often the most observant, and that wisdom, when paired with patience, is a far greater weapon than panicked desperation. While she understood the fear and shame that drove her daughter's terrible choices, she knew that understanding a motive never excuses the betrayal. Her victory wasn't in punishment, but in the calm reclaiming of her life, proving that the strongest boundary is sometimes just a closed door.